All right, so this week what we're looking at is I guess our second type of verb. We start off by looking at the kind of broad overview to the Hebrew verb system by looking at those cal-perfect verbs. And that was our first dive into the world of verbs. And we're going to kind of come back to that world now, but now thinking about a different type of verbs, what we'll call participles. So we'll kind of introduce what those are here. We'll still be in that world of cal verbs, but we'll see that participles also are a good kind of place to do some review because they are verbal, but they also draw on some of the things we looked at a little while back for adjectives. So that's kind of the order of the day here today, and we'll finish off by looking at a couple of things that are a little more recent for us. We'll be looking at the use of pronominal suffixes on our sign of the accusative. So that's what we're up to in this chapter, chapter 16 in Ross. So let's have a look at some of these forms and talk about some items of syntax. Well, let's do a little bit of the overview of the main forms of participles, as well as kind of jog our memory of what a participle is, because chances are most of us wouldn't be able to identify this in English, although we use it all the time. So the kind of departure point for today is understanding that participles are verbal adjectives. So if you were confused by verbs and you were confused by adjectives, great, we're going to be doubly confused here. But if we've picked up some of those basic things about verbs and adjectives, then we'll be able to see how they relate and build into what we're calling participles. Now, in English, we use participles all the time. We probably don't realize it, but most often in English, when we're dealing with any of these verbs that have an ing ending or words with an ing ending, most often those are participles. So for our translations, when we're thinking of Hebrew participles and we're going to be translating them into English, we're going to be using that ing form, that ing kind of on the back end of a verb, as our helping. We've had helping words. This will be kind of a helping morpheme that we'll put on the end of a verb to make it a participle in translation. Now, if we wanted to kind of think of an example in English, we could have the verb to sleep. The participle would be sleeping, for example, in English. We'll also see that we have, if that was, I guess we call that kind of the verbal component of participles. The adjectival component will have to do with their functions. We're going to see that they'll function attributively. So, for example, the sleeping student. They could also function as a predicate. For example, the student who is sleeping. Or substantive. We could just say the sleeper, for example, or the sleeping one. So what we're getting there in those kind of 2 points is that concept of a hybrid. They're verbal, they're expressing an action of some sort, but they're also functioning in the same way that our adjectives function that we learned a while back now. Attributive, predicate, and substantive. So there again we're looking at something new but building on something old. So if that's our kind of overview and a bit of review in there as well, let's look at this table now and talk about the basic patterns that we'll see for our participles. So here we have our verb pakad, but now we've got a paradigm for participles. Now the good news is this is a pretty short paradigm. It's pretty slim. There's not a whole lot to learn here. Really 4 patterns, because participles will be inflected for number and gender. They'll be inflected for number and gender, and for our strong verbs, and by strong verbs we mean those verbs that don't have a guttural in them, they'll be inflected according to this pattern. So what we see there in our masculine singular form is this, pokad. And what we have is a holum in the first position, and then we have a tsere in the second position. Now we've just described that holum tsere pattern for the masculine singular. As you can see, the holum will be throughout, but that tsere will change. Now what we are seeing here in this paradigm is our triliteral root. Then at the end of that triliteral root, we have endings. And if you've been paying attention to our endings here, even by looking at this, what we're seeing in fact are endings that a, im, ot. Those are the very same endings that we had for our adjectives. So when we are looking at this paradigm, pokad, pokada, pokedet, pokdim, pokdot, what we are seeing is a verbal adjective. The verb part is the triliteral root, and then the adjective part is accounted for by those endings. On our feminine singular, in fact, we should have a holum there. So I wanted to kind of walk through it that way, because then when we see that, we can perhaps see that there's more familiar here than there is different. What we'll expect to find for our strong verbs, always, 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 we'll have this holum for our cal active participles. That will always be there. So get used to identifying that. Get used to identifying our endings that are in this position and recognizing them as our adjective endings. And then when we do have those endings added, we'll expect to see this vowel change. But other than that, we're able to recognize most of these materials based on things that we've talked about before. Now, one thing that we could also look at, and we should look at because it's part of our chapter, in fact, is that when we have weak, if we can erase part of this, or we'll work around it. When we have weak characters in here, so we have a guttural in one or more of the positions, we can expect to see some changes. Now, those changes that we see, Ross is describing them as irregular patterns or irregular forms. But the good news is they in fact have some regularity to them once we just know a few of the rules. Now, he talks about two gutturals, so we would have a guttural in this position. Three gutturals, where we'd have a guttural in the next position, and then verbs of the final aleph, which are really just a subset of the of that third guttural. I just want to walk through these briefly, although he does a pretty concise job of explaining them already. So let's talk about the two gutturals that we have here. For these two guttural verbs, or participles rather, one of the things that we should expect to see is that when we need to have a shiva under that guttural, we'll expect to see a compound shiva. Now, if we look at our master paradigm, these forms here would be where, if that was a guttural, we would have a compound, or we would have a regular shiva. But as we know, that can't happen, so rather than having the shiva, we would have a compound shiva. So we'll have a look at our textbook. This is under 16.2. He gives some examples, but really this just comes back to that old rule where gutturals can't take a shiva, so we'll expect a compound shiva. So if that was the one type he describes, the next type he describes are third guttural position verbs. So we have a guttural here. And when we have a guttural here, one of the things that we'll expect to see in those sections of the paradigm where that guttural would be preceded by a full vowel, so for example, under specifically here, or even in this form here, although it looks slightly differently in the paradigm in the textbook, one thing we'll see is we know that our participles, or our gutturals, specifically chet and ayin, at times need some help in their pronunciation. So here we'll expect to see our furtive patach. So the examples he gives, for example, in the masculine singular, from the verb shama, to hear, shomeach. And what we're hearing there in that last position is the patach under the third guttural. So that will be our second type. The third type that he describes, in some ways, is a subset of that. Here he's not talking about just any guttural, but talking specifically about our aleph. So if we can put that in that position. Here again, we're just getting a subset of that verb type, but now reflecting back to, or pointing back to rather, a different type of old rule we've learned. We've kind of seen a number of times that aleph is the weakest of the weak gutturals, and quite often it quiesces, which means it loses any value to hold a vowel on its own, and it's essentially a placeholder. Now, what we see happen in those situations is it quiesces. There will be no vowel under it, and it will kind of inherit or be pronounced with the whatever vowel is before it. So we see that with the verb kara, to call, and we'll see this in the paradigm in the textbook on page 127. You have kore, koreth, for example, in the masculine and feminine singular. So that's the main paradigm. For the most part, what we want to pay attention to or know definitely is this one. A short paradigm, but an important one. Poked, pokda, pokdim, pokdot. Know that one. Be aware of those old rules like quiescence or furtive patach. And if we know our adjective endings, then that should make pretty good sense to us moving forward. But be used to visualizing this and get used to being able to parse it. Well, let's talk a bit about function then. We've talked about the form of the participle. In these next few slides will look quite familiar, in fact, from adjectives. We're talking about syntax here, participles, but as we alluded to kind of earlier on, this is where we draw on that adjectival idea. So if participles are verbal adjectives, then their syntax is predominantly where we're seeing the adjective side of things coming to the equation. So there's going to be our three uses: attributive, predicate, and substantives. Here, the participle modifies the noun for attributive adjectives. In the same way, there, the adjective described something about it. Remember our example, like the blue book? That's the same thing here, where we're getting that participle functioning as a descriptor for some sort of verbal idea related to the noun. We'll look at an example in a minute. But the same thing that we learned for attributive adjectives in terms of recognizing them will apply here as well. And the big thing we flagged there earlier on was that 3-agree rule, that our adjectives and our nouns, in the same way as our participles and the nouns, they'll agree in gender, in number, and in definite status. This is the big one. If that's kind of the main things to know about how they're functioning and how to recognize and remember that 3-agree rule, why don't we just look at this example to illustrate this? This is coming out of Deuteronomy 4:24. Adonai Elohecha Esh Ochla. Now, if we were going to translate that, we would take these two parts together. The Lord your God, and now we know that this ending here is in fact our pronominal suffix. The Lord your God. And the next part, Esh, means fire. Ochla, coming from the verb achal, meaning to eat or to consume. Now, if we wanted to figure out what those are doing together, we'd have to look at a few things. Well, what is their gender? We would be able to identify, hopefully be able to identify that because of the ending here, this is a feminine singular participle. The gender of Esh is in fact a noun that can go either way. It has a common gender, but here we would probably find out that it's a feminine. Also singular, so we have the agreement there in gender and number. And the definite status. What we're not seeing here is a definite article on either one of these. So we have that 3-agree rule where these two will be functioning together in terms of their syntax, and in terms of parsing that second form, that would be an attributive adjective. So to translate that, what we would translate is the Lord your God, we'd probably supply is, because we need a verb in English, is a consuming fire, with the ing they're coming because we're translating a participle. So really not a whole lot new here. If we know that paradigm from the last slide and remember our 3-agree rule, we can apply that lesson from adjectives to participles, and the same translation will be what we're going for. Only now we're going to be translating out with an ing verb. So attributive adjectives and attributive participles are playing by many of the same rules. Well, let's look at this second use then, our predicate use of the participle. Now here what we're seeing is the participle is not modifying a noun, but similar to what we saw with our adjectives, it's asserting something about it. It's functioning verbally, and the type of action that it will be expressing is most often linear or ongoing, or I think what Ross calls durative, an ongoing action. In terms of recognizing these things, again, this is where our homework on adjectives pays off, because we're going to be looking at agreement in gender and number, but not in definite status. So we're looking for discord or disagreement. Now, if we look back at our chapter on predicate adjectives, one of the things we said is that the predicate adjective will usually precede the noun it modifies. Here we're getting a bit of a different situation where most often predicate participles will actually follow the noun they modify. So that little hint that we looked at earlier is not going to be much help for us here. But the big tell of the predicate participles, as with the predicate adjectives, is disagreement in their definite status. So let's look at this example here. Hamalach holech el hahekal. All right, if we want to translate this, we could probably parse out a few of these things. We start with what we know. Let's start at the very end. Why do we start here? To the temple. El to ha-hekal, the temple. Now, the very first word is a recent vocab word for us, hamalach. Remember, this is an angel or a messenger, the angel or the messenger, because in the front end we have our definite article with our dagesh and the mem. So this is the angel or the messenger. Now, the form for us to think about for today is this one here, holech. Now, this is a masculine singular participle. Remember our paradigm, we had pokad with the holem tsere. So this is a masculine singular participle. And if you want to ask what it agrees with, we'd want to start looking at this form hamalach. And if we do our homework, we would see that this is as we said, a masculine singular participle. This too is masculine singular, so they agree. They're going to function together. But where they disagree is we don't have a definite article in this position on holech. Therefore, this must be a predicate participle. Therefore, we would translate something like the angel was or is going, with that ing verb, to the temple. So what we're seeing here again is very similar to what we looked at with adjectives, predicate adjectives. Remember, what we're looking at is, or trying to identify here, is discord between the predicate adjective and the noun it modifies. And don't be thrown off by the fact that the participle, the predicate participle, may follow the noun it modifies, as we have in this example here. All right, here's one last usage that we want to identify before we move on. We had substantive adjectives, and those were nouns, or adjectives rather, that stood in the place of a noun in a sentence. And that's much what we have here. Substantive participles can stand independently, essentially as a noun. And their usage is quite often to describe somebody who performs a certain verbal idea. So for that reason, quite often we're going to use a little bit of a helping phrase. The one who, for example, that we might see in our example below, is what we'll use to help make sense of these participles in English, at least at times. So how do you recognize these things? Well, much like with our predicate adjectives, there's no noun in the near vicinity that they agree with and modify, therefore they're standing in as a noun here, expressing a verbal idea. So our example that we have here, hayoshevet baganim. Hayoshevet baganim. If we kind of carve this up, we could see that this is in the, there's our patach lingering from our definite article, as well as their dagesh. In the gardens. Gan was our singular for garden, so in the gardens. So that explains the very end, but what about our participle? What about this item on the front end of the phrase? What we see here, if we were to kind of break this down, is we do have our definite article, the. Yoshevet, this is coming from yeshav, and this would be a feminine singular. But there's no other noun for this to agree with, so it can't be attributive, it can't be a predicate, therefore it must be a substantive. Therefore we could say this is we'd probably translate this as the one who dwells in the garden. With this whole phrase in our translation coming from really this noun, or this participle here. The one who dwells in the garden. The one who dwells is our substantive participle. It's standing in for a noun, and it's describing an individual or an entity that has a verbal action, here dwelling. If that seems a little bit abstract, we've learned, in fact, many vocabulary words, or we will learn many vocabulary words, that are essentially substantive participles. So if we look at our list on the left here in the purple, oyev, this word meaning enemy, is essentially, it's a substantive participle. Roeh, the same thing. This means shepherd, but it's a participle, come from the verb to shepherd. Yoshev, as we have here, inhabitant. The one who dwells in the gardens, we could also say the inhabitant of the garden. Choseh, meaning seers, one who sees. That comes from the verb chatzah. This is an interesting one, these last two, in fact. Kohen, this means priest. But it actually is a substantive participle coming from the verb kohen, to priest, which sounds odd to us in English, but this is a participle in Hebrew. And then lastly, one that's very familiar to us, chauffet, from the verb to judge. This is the term chauffet. Even in the book of Judges is most often a substantive participle. It's the judging one, the one who judges, the one who is judging. So substantive participles stand on their own. There's nothing for them to agree or disagree with, and they're expressing some sort of verbal idea for that individual, that entity. Therefore, we might translate these quite often as the one who, or have another translation equivalent like enemies, shepherd, seers, priests, whatever the case may be. The main thing to recognize here is that there's nothing to agree with in the immediate vicinity, but they play by the same rules as our paradigm. We'll have that holum in the initial position, as well as those inflected endings that we're used to seeing in our adjectives. So know that paradigm and know a little bit about the different uses, and you should be able to identify if we have a substantive, attributive, or a predicate participle. All right, well, here's our last item of the day. It's another look at pronominal suffixes, but this time we're looking at them in the context of our sign of the accusative. We also called that our definite direct object marker. Remember, this was that signpost in a sentence that pointed towards the direct object. Now, in sentences where a pronoun is the object of a verb, that pronominal object, may be indicated by a suffixed form of our forms that we see here. And we looked at these a while ago. We also looked at pronominal suffixes, and now we're just putting those two things together. Here what we see is the same endings that we've seen before, only now they're not attached to our inseparable prepositions like le or b, or the nouns that we looked at most recently, but they're suffixed to it or it, and they're there to signal that object of a sentence. So if we look at this paradigm and we kind of run through it briefly, what we'll see is those same endings on this same form that we've looked at already. So let's just do this, and we'll kind of end the day there. Oto, ota, otecha, otach, oti, otam, otan, etchen, etchen, otanu. What we're hearing in those forms is absolutely nothing new. All we're hearing is a suffixed form of the sign of the accusative with those endings that we already know. O, a, echa, ach, I, an, chem, chen, anu. So here again, I think this is kind of a fitting place to end the chapter with that same idea, as we've even seen with participles, that most often in Hebrew, things are kind of foggy. It takes some time to settle in. But once we learn an idea or a concept in one place, like these pronominal suffixes, like our adjective syntax, that really kind of feeds into something later on. So I hope that this chapter with participles, we're kind of pushing forward to something new, gives us a chance to learn obviously those new items there, but also a reason to go back and review some of those things. So if pronominal suffixes are still foggy, definitely go back and have a look at the few places we've seen those because they're important. If adjectives are still foggy, definitely go back and look at those because there's going to be a real payoff for us in how we understand our participles.